It was roughly 20 minutes into what Adam Schiff appeared to believe would be a defining moment. The kind of televised confrontation politicians imagine when they picture history books and legacy clips, the moment where preparation meets opportunity and the cameras finally align. From Schiff's perspective, this was supposed to be the long-awaited payoff, a rare chance to question Donald Trump directly, in real time, with no intermediaries and no friendly moderators to soften the exchange. For years, Schiff had built a public identity around one central claim, that he had seen things the public could not see, that classified briefings contained troubling information that justified his warnings. This was supposed to be the setting where that authority finally crystallized into something undeniable, where Trump would either answer or dodge, and either way reinforce Schiff's narrative. At least, that seemed to be the assumption walking into the room. What complicates moments like this is that power doesn't always belong to the person asking the questions, especially when the person being questioned controls the stage, the timing, and the materials on display. By the time the press conference reached its third segment, the atmosphere had shifted in a way that was difficult to describe but impossible to miss. A subtle recalibration of energy that seasoned reporters recognize instinctively. Trump did not look defensive or combative in the usual sense. Instead, he looked oddly methodical, almost instructional, as if he were less interested in sparring than in presenting. That difference alone raised eyebrows because it suggested foreknowledge, not improvisation. The room sensed it before anyone could articulate it. Trump's framing from the podium was careful, emphasizing transparency, review, and public access, rather than vindication or revenge, which itself invited a different kind of scrutiny. He spoke less like a defendant rebutting charges and more like someone claiming to open a filing cabinet and let the public draw its own conclusions. Whether one accepted that framing or not, the rhetorical shift mattered, because it placed responsibility back on viewers rather than demanding allegiance. Instead of asserting that anyone had lied, Trump repeatedly suggested that Americans should compare what officials said publicly with what documents appeared to say privately. That distinction, subtle as it was, proved crucial. When Adam Schiff stood to ask his first question, the posture was familiar, measured, prosecutorial without being overtly aggressive, designed to embed assumptions inside inquiry. The question itself followed a pattern anyone who has watched congressional hearings would recognize, referencing documented contacts and concealment while leaving the burden of refutation on the subject. In another setting, that approach might have produced the intended effect, a deflection, a denial, a verbal scuffle ripe for post-show analysis. Instead, Trump responded by redirecting attention away from interpretation and toward record-keeping. That pivot changed everything. The first document displayed did not arrive with commentary or editorial flourish. It simply appeared on the screens behind the podium, complete with dates, titles, and official markings. Trump read from it slowly, almost deliberately, allowing viewers enough time to process the language for themselves rather than rushing toward a conclusion. The document, as presented, summarized an intelligence assessment that described investigations as ongoing while stating that no evidence of coordination had been identified at that time. Importantly, Trump emphasized the date, not to argue finality, but to anchor the discussion temporally. That anchoring would become a recurring theme. At that point, the issue was no longer whether investigations existed, something no one disputed, but how their interim conclusions were characterized publicly. Trump then introduced a second visual, an attendance record, showing who had been present for the briefing in question. Adam Schiff's name appeared among others, neither highlighted nor obscured, simply listed. Trump did not claim that this proved wrongdoing. Instead, he posed a question about consistency. What did attendees understand at the time, and how did they describe it afterward? This is where the moment became less about Trump and more about media memory. Footage of Schiff from earlier appearances aired, not selectively but sequentially, showing variations of a single assertion repeated across months. The phrasing changed slightly, but the core idea remained constant, that Schiff had seen evidence beyond the circumstantial. Trump did not label those statements false. He juxtaposed them with the earlier briefing language and asked viewers what they noticed. The absence of overt accusation was, paradoxically, more unsettling than a direct charge. As the timeline advanced, the pattern repeated. Briefings followed by public statements that seemed, at least on their face, to emphasize certainty over ambiguity. Trump's presentation did not argue that intelligence assessments can never change, an assertion that would be easy to dismiss. Instead, he asked whether those changes were reflected accurately in real time, or whether certainty was projected before substantiation. That distinction matters in a democracy that relies on trust between institutions and the public. It also raises uncomfortable questions about incentives. One of the more striking elements was Trump's reliance on Schiff's own words rather than commentary from allies or critics. The supercut that followed did not editorialize. It compiled. Viewers were left to watch the same claim articulated in different studios, under different banners, to different audiences. The repetition itself became the point, not the tone. It invited the audience to ask whether repetition alone can harden uncertainty into perceived fact. At this stage, Schiff attempted to interject, framing the discussion around evolving intelligence and contextual nuance. That argument is not inherently unreasonable, and in many cases, it would be persuasive. What complicated it here was the sequencing, the fact that each claim appeared tied closely to briefings that, as shown, expressed caution rather than confirmation. Trump's response did not deny the possibility of evolution. He asked why the public language appeared to skip the uncertainty phase altogether. Again, the question lingered without a definitive answer being imposed. As the presentation continued, additional materials appeared, including summaries of investigative updates and assessments of secondary sources. Each was presented with dates and attendance lists, reinforcing the chronological framework rather than arguing substance alone. Trump's approach remained consistent, focusing on what was known when and how it was described. The cumulative effect was not explosive but erosive, gradually wearing down the assumption that confident public statements always mirrored cautious private briefings. That erosion was visible not just on Schiff's face, but across the room. Perhaps the most uncomfortable moments came when Trump shifted from intelligence assessments to process, particularly how narratives enter the media bloodstream. Phone logs and timelines were displayed not as proof of intent, but as correlations that invited scrutiny. Trump avoided words like leak in favor of sequence, asking viewers to notice how stories often followed conversations. He framed it as something journalists themselves might want to examine. That rhetorical move subtly enlisted the press as participants rather than targets. When the topic moved to Ukraine, the tone sharpened, though it never tipped into accusation. Trump replayed footage of Schiff's remarks from impeachment proceedings and compared them with the released transcript of the call in question. Rather than declaring fabrication, Trump asked whether essence had drifted too far from substance. It was a semantic argument as much as a political one. Viewers were left to consider where interpretation ends and invention begins. The issue of the whistleblower followed a similar pattern, with timelines and statements placed side by side. Trump highlighted discrepancies between public denials of contact and subsequent acknowledgments of staff interactions. He did not assert illegality, he questioned transparency. That distinction mattered because it reframed the debate around credibility rather than culpability. For an audience fatigued by years of absolutist claims, the nuance was striking. By the time the Hunter Biden laptop discussion emerged, the room had grown palpably tense. Trump again relied on briefings, dates, and public statements, asking how assessments were characterized externally. He did not say anyone knowingly misled the public. He asked why certainty was expressed when internal briefings appeared more restrained. The repetition of this theme reinforced its centrality. This was not about any single incident, but about pattern recognition. The reference to the letter signed by former intelligence officials introduced an additional layer, one involving coordination and perception. Emails were shown that suggested outreach and messaging alignment, though Trump stopped short of assigning motive. He asked whether the public deserved to know how such statements are assembled. The implication was not criminal conspiracy, but institutional echo. That question resonated beyond party lines. When Trump finally turned back to Schiff directly, the moment felt less confrontational than contemplative. The question he posed was not framed as an indictment, but as a reflection. How often, Trump asked, did confidence outpace confirmation? It was a question that could apply to many figures across many administrations. That universality made it harder to dismiss. Schiff's silence in response was widely interpreted, though interpretations varied. Some saw shock, others calculation, still others resignation. Trump did not press further, allowing the moment to stand on its own. In media terms, that restraint proved effective. Silence, after all, is often more narratively powerful than argument. By the time the press conference concluded, the story had already escaped the room. Clips circulated not because of insults or shouting, but because of juxtaposition. The internet thrives on contrast, and this event provided it in abundance. Viewers debated not just Trump and Schiff, but the broader relationship between secrecy and trust. That debate continues. What followed in the days and weeks afterward became less about one press conference and more about institutional reckoning. Ethics reviews, media retrospectives, and partisan responses unfolded as they always do. Supporters and critics of Schiff interpreted the same materials differently, often through existing loyalties. Yet even among sympathetic voices, questions emerged that were difficult to wave away. That alone marked a shift. The long-term impact of the episode may not lie in any single conclusion, but in the caution it introduced. Claims based on unseen evidence now meet a more skeptical audience. Reporters ask follow-up questions they once accepted as unaskable. Viewers demand timelines rather than assurances. In that sense, the moment reshaped expectations more than reputations. If there is an irony here, it is that the press conference was not remembered for what Trump said about himself. It was remembered for what documents appeared to say about the gap between private briefings and public certainty. That gap, once noticed, is hard to unsee. Whether one believes it reflects error, overconfidence, or something else entirely is a matter of interpretation. But the question itself now lingers. Political history is full of moments where narratives collapse not because they are disproven, but because they are complicated. This felt like one of those moments. Not a verdict, not a confession, not an arrest, just a comparison. And sometimes comparison is enough to unsettle what once felt solid. The rest is left to the audience. And here's the part that still nags at me, even after the hot takes fade, and the clip chasers move on to the next shiny outrage. When you strip away the team jerseys, what you're watching is a stress test of a basic American bargain. Officials get access to secrets, and the public trusts them not to turn that access into a political prop. Most voters can't parse an intelligence memo, don't know what confidence level really means, and don't have the time to track which assessment was superseded by which update. So when someone like Adam Schiff says, in plain English, "I've seen evidence," people understandably hear certainty, not nuance. They hear a grown-up in the room telling them the stove is hot, and they back away. That's why the optics of that press conference landed the way they did, regardless of how you feel about Donald Trump as a person or as a president. It wasn't a normal political argument where both sides toss adjectives like dodgeballs. It was an argument about receipts, about dates, about what was said when, and whether the public was led to believe one thing while private briefings suggested something less dramatic. Even if you think Trump's motive was personal, and plenty of people do, motive doesn't erase the question the material raised. If the content is real, then the content forces a conversation that goes beyond the personalities. And that conversation is uncomfortable for a lot of people in Washington because it threatens a very profitable habit. There's a whole industry built around hinting, implying, and I can't say more, like the nation is perpetually one classified paragraph away from the season finale. Cable news especially loves this format because ambiguity is reusable, and reusable is billable. If you can't show the public the source, you can sell the mood instead, and the mood is always urgent. It's the political equivalent of a horror movie where the monster is off-screen for 2 hours because the budget is tight. Now, to be clear, intelligence work is messy, and anyone pretending otherwise is either naive or selling something. Assessments can be wrong, incomplete, revised, contradicted by later discoveries, and sometimes buried under internal bureaucracy that makes your eyes glaze over. None of that is shocking. It's literally how large institutions function. The real question is what happens when someone takes that messy, conditional reality and markets it to the public as clean certainty. Is that oversimplification? Or is it something darker, like an incentive structure rewarding the most dramatic version of the truth? Because if you're Adam Schiff, and you're building a brand as the sober guardian against Donald Trump, there's a temptation to speak in absolutes. Absolutes are easier to remember, easier to repeat, easier to clip, and easier to fundraise on. Here's the situation, and it's complicated, doesn't break through the noise like, "I've seen evidence." It's not that nuance is wrong, it's just that nuance doesn't trend. And in modern politics, what doesn't trend might as well not exist. That's why the timeline approach mattered so much in the presentation as it was described. It forced everything back into sequence. And sequence is a cruel judge because it doesn't care about spin. When you lay claim A next to briefing language B, and then you do that again and again, it becomes less about any single discrepancy and more about pattern. If it's one contradiction, people shrug and call it human error. If it's a string of contradictions, people start asking whether the error is the point. And here's where the humor creeps in. Because American politics is so absurd, you sometimes have to laugh just to stay sane. We've somehow built a system where saying, "Trust me, it's classified," can function like a magic wand. Wave it, and reporters get cautious, critics get nervous, and supporters get more devoted, because it feels like you're protecting them from something they can't see. It's like a parent telling a kid, "Don't open that closet," and the kid immediately believes the closet contains a demon. Sometimes it's just old coats, but the warning creates its own mythology. So when Trump, of all people, decides to buy into a show your work presentation, it breaks the expected script. Trump is usually a vibes politician, and his critics love to say he lives in a fog of self-serving narrative. But the story you're telling here is that he stepped into a different posture. Not, "Believe me," but "Look at this." Whether that was strategic, theatrical, or genuinely motivated by a desire to reshape the record, it worked on the level of optics. The audience didn't have to love Trump. They just had to see a contradiction and wonder what else they'd been sold. That's also why Schiff's attempt to return to context and evolution didn't fully rescue the moment. Those are valid concepts, but they require the speaker to appear like they're taking responsibility for how their words landed. If the public heard certainty and you meant caution, you have to own that gap. You can't just say, "intelligence evolves," and expect people to forget you sounded like you were reading from a verdict. Americans can tolerate complexity, but they hate feeling played. And feeling played is exactly what social media feeds on. Not ideology, not policy, not even truth, necessarily, but betrayal. A betrayal narrative is sticky because it lets people feel both wronged and righteous at the same time. You defended someone, and now you feel foolish, so you flip that shame outward into anger. That's how a lot of political fandom collapses overnight. Not by persuasion, but by embarrassment. If the clips really spread the way your story describes, then the public reaction makes sense in a depressing way. People weren't just reacting to Adam Schiff. They were reacting to the broader ritual of sanctimony in politics. They were watching a man who had positioned himself as the responsible adult suddenly forced to answer for how he used that authority. And even if you don't accept the most damning interpretation, you can still understand why the optics were lethal. In politics, sometimes the appearance of contradiction is indistinguishable from contradiction itself. Then comes the second-order problem, the one Washington never wants to talk about out loud: the media's role. For years, Schiff's claims were difficult to challenge because the underlying material was inaccessible. That created a structural dependency. Journalists had to trust what an official said they saw. And once that trust becomes habitual, it becomes lazy, even if no one intends it to. A newsroom doesn't want to accuse a senior intelligence committee figure of overstating classified content without proof. So the claim slides through. But the public doesn't grade journalists on structural obstacles. They grade journalists on outcomes. If the outcome looks like 8 years of "we were told," followed by one day of "here it is," people naturally ask why the skepticism wasn't present earlier. That's not always fair, but it's predictable. And once that suspicion takes root, it spreads beyond any one story. It becomes a generalized belief that elites protect each other with complexity. That's why the aftershocks described in your narrative feel believable as a political dynamic, regardless of what you think about specifics. Ethics complaints, internal party distancing, awkward defenses on friendly networks. Those are the standard reflexes when an issue threatens to become radioactive. Parties don't always defend their members on principle. They defend based on risk. If a controversy starts to look like an anchor, they cut the rope. Loyalty is real until it costs too much. And then suddenly, everyone discovers concerns. Now, I want to be careful here because there's a difference between saying "this looks bad" and saying "this proves intent." Intent is hard to prove, and claiming to know what was in someone's head is usually a shortcut to propaganda. But voters don't need proof of intent to change their trust calculus. They just need to believe the speaker's incentives were misaligned with the public's interest. And in this story, the incentives look messy. Take the Ukraine Essence episode, for example, because it's a perfect case study in political language. There's an art to summarizing, and then there's a temptation to dramatize. If you're a committee chair trying to set a tone, you might believe you're capturing the spirit of a call, rather than quoting it. But the moment you do that, you gamble that the underlying transcript won't later be used as a yardstick. If the yardstick shows the summary stretched too far, the speaker loses credibility even if their broader point survives. The whistleblower timeline works similarly in terms of optics, not verdicts. Contact between staff and a complainant may be normal, may be questionable, may be routine, may be political. Reasonable people can disagree. But denying contact, and then later dealing with evidence of contact, creates a credibility crater. It doesn't matter if the contact was benign. The denial makes it look like concealment. In politics, you can survive a complicated process, but you rarely survive a simple contradiction. Then the laptop episode enters like gasoline because it blends intelligence framing with election timing, which is the third rail of American trust. Even people who don't follow details tend to remember the broad outlines. A story drops, officials label it something, platforms react, voters argue, and later the story evolves. If the public believes officials used institutional credibility to pre-shape the narrative, they feel manipulated. Again, not convicted, not adjudicated, but manipulated. And manipulation is the one thing Americans hate more than being wrong. That's where the letter from former intelligence officials becomes such a loaded symbol. On one hand, it can be read as a group of experienced people offering a professional instinct. On the other hand, it can be read as a tool designed to manufacture permission for others to dismiss uncomfortable information. The second interpretation is what makes people furious, because it suggests credibility was used like a shield for a political outcome. And once that suspicion forms, every future letter like that gets treated like a press release in a lab coat. The brand damage is enormous. The subtle irony is that Donald Trump, who has been accused for years of attacking institutions, would in this story position himself as the one demanding institutional accountability. That's not a moral endorsement. It's a narrative inversion. And inversions are catnip for the public because they create cognitive dissonance. People don't know what to do with a storyline where the norms guy looks slippery and the chaos guy looks organized. So they share it, argue about it, and amplify it. And that brings us back to Adam Schiff's alleged silence in that room. Silence is interpretive clay. Everyone molds it into whatever they already believe. Trump supporters call it admission, Trump critics call it ambush shock, neutrals call it political stagecraft. But in media, silence is rarely neutral. It's a vacuum, and the internet hates vacuums. The vacuum gets filled with captions, reaction memes, and 1,000 confident narrators insisting they can read minds. What's almost funny, in a bleak way, is how modern politics has trained people to treat a man looking uncomfortable as proof of metaphysical guilt. We've become a nation of amateur facial expression analysts. One raised eyebrow becomes a confession. One awkward pause becomes a scandal. One blink becomes caught. If the founders could see this, they'd probably write a new amendment. Congress shall make no law based on vibes. But alas, vibes are the currency now, and receipts are rare enough that they cause a stampede. Now, if the story continues the way you described, party distancing, committee votes, approval drops, there's a broader lesson hiding in plain sight. Political institutions punish not just wrongdoing, but vulnerability. The moment someone becomes a liability, the system doesn't ask, "Is this fair?" First, it asks, "Can we survive this?" That's why you can see sudden shifts where defenders become critics overnight. They don't always change their beliefs, they change their math. And the math is always about the next election. What would be especially damaging in a scenario like this is the combination of specificity and repetition. If the public is shown a single document, they can argue over interpretation. If they're shown a stack of dated materials aligned with a long series of public claims, the debate shifts from maybe to how many. And how many is the question that kills a public figure because it implies pattern, not mistake. A pattern suggests a habit, and habits are hard to excuse. That's why the rhetorical question, "How many times did you mislead the public?" lands harder than a direct accusation. It forces the listener to do the counting mentally. It invites them to imagine repetition, to picture a loop, to feel the weight of it. It's also hard to rebut. because rebutting it requires explaining each instance in context, which is tedious and time-consuming. In politics, anything that requires a 3-minute explanation loses to a 10-second clip. And when Schiff later goes to a friendly network and leans on the complexity defense, it doesn't land because the audience isn't debating complexity anymore. They're debating trust. Complexity is a reason, not an apology, and it doesn't address the emotional core. Why did you sound so certain? Why did you talk like you had a smoking gun if the briefings, at least as presented, didn't read like one? If you want to repair trust, you have to address that gap directly, not rhetorically. If you add a little satire, it's almost like Washington invented a new religion. Classified says so. The doctrine is simple. If an official says they saw it in a briefing, you must accept it, because you cannot check it. Heresy is asking for proof, because proof might endanger sources and methods, a phrase that has become the political version of "don't ask what's in the sauce." Most of the time, that caution is legitimate. But when it's abused, it turns legitimate secrecy into a get-out-of-accountability card. And that brings up the deeper, more unsettling possibility that people whisper about when they're being honest. Not that any single person is a villain twirling a mustache, but that systems reward certain behaviors. If you get attention and influence by speaking with maximum certainty, you will be tempted to speak with maximum certainty. If you can't be fact-checked because the underlying materials are classified, you have even more incentive to overstate. And if the press repeats your claims because the alternative is accusing you of exaggeration without proof, you become effectively insulated. That's not a conspiracy, it's a feedback loop. In that sense, the lesson people took from this press conference, rightly or wrongly, was not simply Adam Schiff is bad or Donald Trump is good. The lesson was, this system lets people get away with too much behind a curtain. That's why even some viewers who can't stand Trump still found themselves unsettled. They weren't cheering, they were recalibrating. They were thinking, if this can happen here, where else has it happened? And here's where my personal view kicks in, because you asked for a piece that leans into personal perspective rather than pretending to be an omniscient narrator. I don't think most political figures wake up intending to become cartoon villains. I think they wake up intending to win, to control the narrative, to survive the week, to avoid looking weak on camera. And then the incentives do the rest, turning small rhetorical shortcuts into full-blown habits. At some point, the habit becomes the identity. So when a moment arrives where documents are displayed, timelines are drawn, and the gap is made visible, it doesn't just threaten one person. It threatens the whole style of politics that relies on implying certainty without providing proof. It's why people in both parties get nervous when declassification and public record enter the chat. Because today, it's your enemy, and tomorrow, it might be you. And Washington's favorite rule is, don't normalize weapons you wouldn't want used on yourself. If, in your narrative, new protocols and reforms follow, certifications, penalties, required reviews, that would be the institutional attempt to contain the damage. Not necessarily because everyone suddenly became virtuous, but because the system hates unpredictability. A public scandal around classified briefings makes every future briefing more politically dangerous. It makes members wonder whether their words will later be compared line by line with what they heard. And it makes the intelligence community nervous that their work will be used as a partisan cudgel, which affects morale and cooperation. That's why, in a story like this, the final legacy isn't about a single press conference. It's about a shift in public expectation. People start demanding timelines instead of adjectives. They ask, when did you learn this? Instead of, how bad is it? They become suspicious of officials who speak like they're reading from a secret file no one else can see, and that suspicion becomes a permanent tax on future credibility. The most brutal part, politically, is that once the public sees the gap, they stop granting the benefit of the doubt. They start interpreting everything as strategy. Every clarification becomes backtracking. Every nuance becomes spin. Every refusal becomes hiding something. This isn't fair to honest officials, but politics is rarely fair. It's a trust economy, and a trust economy doesn't recover quickly once the market crashes. So the crescendo of the story, the resignation, the censure, the rewritten legacy, functions as narrative closure, but it also functions as a warning label. Not a verdict, not a courtroom outcome, but a cultural memory. Be careful when someone claims secret certainty, because secret certainty is the perfect product: high impact, low accountability, and easy to sell. And the American public, once burned, becomes a harsher customer. If there's a final wry observation that sticks with me, it's this. For years, Trump critics begged for accountability and transparency from Donald Trump. And in this story, the most consequential transparency event ends up landing on Adam Schiff instead. That kind of irony isn't just dramatic. It's politically destabilizing. It scrambles the old moral map and forces people to redraw it in real time. And when a country is forced to redraw its moral map, everyone gets louder, not wiser. The question then isn't just what happened in that room or who won the day in the short-term media cycle. The question is, what happens after, when voters carry this skepticism into the next controversy? When the next official says, "Trust me," how many people will say, "No, show me"? When the next scandal breaks, how many people will assume it's shaped more by incentives than by truth? And what does a democracy look like when skepticism becomes the default setting for everything? Because maybe the most haunting possibility is that nobody has to be a mastermind for the damage to be real. It's enough for people to chase advantage, clip-worthy certainty, and narrative dominance. It's enough for institutions to protect themselves, for media to follow the loudest framing, and for audiences to reward the most emotionally satisfying interpretation. Put those ingredients together, and you don't need a conspiracy. You get a machine. And when that machine gets exposed, even partially, even through one heavily watched confrontation, the public doesn't respond with calm deliberation. It responds with the only tools it feels it has left: mockery, outrage, and withdrawal of trust. That's why the memes spread faster than the analysis. That's why jokes land harder than nuance. Because humor is how people cope with the realization that their trusted experts might be just as political as everyone else. So, if you're asking me how to interpret the end of this story, Adam Schiff diminished, Donald Trump satisfied, the press scrambling, the public dividing into camps again, I'd say it's less a triumph than a symptom of a system that runs on credibility while constantly gambling it, a symptom of institutions that demand trust without always earning it, and a symptom of a culture that prefers theatrical certainty over careful honesty. Right up until the moment careful honesty is weaponized against theatrical certainty.